The morning of Promise Day arrived quietly, without any dramatic announcement. The sunlight slipped through the sheer curtains of our bedroom, settling gently across the floor, the dresser, the edges of a life that felt settled and known. I remember lying there for a moment longer than usual, listening to the familiar rhythm of the house, the soft hum of the heater, the distant sound of traffic beginning its weekday crawl, the quiet normalcy that had come to define our marriage. Promise Day had never been about grand gestures for us. It wasn't flashy or performative. It was always smaller, more intimate, about words spoken without an audience, about trust that didn't need witnesses. I got up slowly, careful not to wake him yet. There was a kind of calm satisfaction in moving through the morning on my own, knowing exactly where everything was, knowing how the day would unfold, or at least believing I did. On the kitchen counter sat the card I had bought a week earlier, cream-colored, simple. No glitter, no exaggerated font, just a few words on the front about keeping promises, about choosing the same person every day. I had read it several times before buying it, not because I needed convincing, but because it felt accurate, honest, like us. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise. My phone buzzed briefly, an early work email, and I ignored it. Promise Day deserved my attention. Our relationship deserved that pause. We had always been good with promises, or at least that's how it felt. The big ones had already been made years ago in front of family, paperwork, and a shared understanding of what commitment meant. What remained were the quieter promises, staying consistent, staying transparent, staying aligned. I walked into the living room and picked up the small envelope I had prepared the night before. Inside it was my handwritten note. Not poetic, not dramatic, just clear. I promised steadiness. I promised respect. I promised honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. Writing it hadn't felt risky. It felt natural. On the side table sat his Promise Day gift. Nothing expensive, a leather-bound planner he'd mentioned needing, tucked neatly beside a pen engraved with his initials. It wasn't about cost. It never was. It was about acknowledgement, about saying, I see you and I'm still here. Financially, we were comfortable. Not extravagant, but secure. Our joint savings had quietly crossed $42,000 earlier that year, a number we had both smiled at when we noticed it, not because it changed anything, but because it represented years of consistency, discipline, shared planning. He'd recently received a $12,500 performance bonus at work, and we'd talked casually about putting most of it toward future goals. There had been no tension in that conversation, no hesitation, just agreement. That sense of alignment was everywhere that morning. I adjusted the card once more on the table, straightening it as if the angle mattered. I knew it didn't, but small rituals have a way of grounding you. They make emotions feel tangible, manageable. When he finally came into the kitchen, still half asleep, he smiled the way he always did, familiar, easy, unforced. He kissed my cheek, poured himself coffee, and asked about my plans for the day. Nothing felt off. Nothing felt delayed or distracted. You remembered, he said lightly, nodding toward the card. Of course I do. I always do. And I meant it, not just about Promise Day, but about us, about the commitment underneath everything else. We sat together at the table for a few minutes, sipping coffee, talking about mundane things, meetings, groceries, a trip we'd been casually planning for later in the year. His voice was calm, steady. He spoke about the future as if it were a given, something already mapped out. I promise I'm not going anywhere, he said at one point, almost casually, as if it were an obvious fact rather than a reassurance. I didn't need him to say it. That was the thing. I already believed it. Promise Day, to me, wasn't about extracting guarantees. It was about reaffirming something that already felt solid. Words didn't feel fragile that morning. They felt reinforced by routine, by shared accounts, by years of consistency. I handed him the envelope with my note, watching his expression as he read it. He smiled again, softer this time, and reached for my hand. You don't make promises lightly, he said. That's one of the things I love about you. I felt a quiet warmth settle in my chest. Not excitement, not adrenaline, but something steadier. Trust. The kind that doesn't rush. Later that morning, as I got ready for work, I caught my reflection in the mirror and noticed how relaxed I looked. There was no tension in my shoulders, no second guessing in my eyes. I looked like someone who felt secure in her life, in her choices. And I was. At least that's how it felt. Promise Day moved forward gently, without friction. Messages exchanged between meetings, a quick call during lunch, a shared understanding that we'd do something simple together later that evening. Nothing extravagant, just time. There was no reason to doubt anything, no reason to question words that matched actions, no reason to look beyond what was being offered openly. If anything, I felt confident, almost certain that we were doing something right, that our version of love didn't need constant proof because it was built on structure, on transparency, on years of showing up. I remember thinking, briefly, how fortunate I felt, how many people struggled with uncertainty, with instability, with broken promises. I believed we were past that stage, that whatever challenges existed, they were manageable because honesty was still intact. Promise Day in my mind stood for clarity, for intention, for the quiet reassurance that commitment wasn't fragile when handled with care. I had no reason to believe otherwise. Not that morning. Not with the sunlight steady on the floor. Not with the card resting neatly on the table. Not with words spoken so softly, so confidently, that they felt permanent. And in that calm certainty, I held the day gently, unaware that what felt most secure is often what we question last. The house didn't change after Promise Day ended. The light still came in the same way through the windows. The clock above the hallway still ticked at the same measured pace. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet something had shifted. It started with time. He said he'd be late, not unusually late, just enough to sound reasonable. A meeting that ran longer than expected, a client who needed reassurance. His voice was calm when he said it, familiar, almost comforting. I believed him without effort. Promise Day had already passed quietly between us. There had been no grand gesture, no ceremonial moment, just soft words exchanged over breakfast, a sentence spoken gently, as if it didn't need emphasis to be true. I carried that sentence with me through the day, the way you carry something fragile, carefully, instinctively. So when evening came and he wasn't home, I didn't question it. Dinner stayed warm longer than it should have. The lights stayed on. The house waited. When he finally walked in, he apologized easily. No urgency, no tension. His jacket went on the chair the same way it always did. His phone slid face down onto the counter, screen dark. He kissed my cheek. It felt normal, too normal to interrupt. That night, while he slept, I lay awake longer than usual. Not because of suspicion, just awareness, a strange sense that the rhythm I trusted had slightly misaligned, like music playing a half-second offbeat. The next morning, I noticed the calendar. Nothing obvious, no red flags, just a small adjustment. An appointment moved, a note erased, another added in different handwriting. It shouldn't have mattered, and yet I looked at it longer than I needed to. I told myself it was nothing, but small moments have weight when they gather quietly. Over the next few days, there were delays that required no defense. Messages answered later than usual, calls returned with the same warmth, just less presence. His words still matched his tone, but his timing didn't. Promise Day had been about assurance. What followed felt like postponement. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions shaped like accusations. I didn't even feel angry. What I felt was something less dramatic and more unsettling, uncertainty that didn't announce itself. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork we usually ignored, I noticed a transaction summary left open on the desk. Not hidden, not secretive, just there, as if it didn't expect to be questioned. The number wasn't alarming. It wasn't even large enough to raise concern on its own, but the date stood out. Midweek. Same day he'd stayed late. Same day Promise Day faded into routine. I closed the file without reacting. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't memorize the amount. I simply registered it, the way you register a sound that doesn't belong to the room you're in. Later that night, he spoke softly again, The same reassuring cadence, the same practiced calm. His promises didn't contradict anything I'd seen. They just floated slightly above it, untouched. That's when I understood something important. Disbelief doesn't always arrive with shock. Sometimes it arrives with silence. I began paying attention without changing my behavior. I stayed the same. I smiled the same. I responded the same way. But internally, I slowed down. I noticed how often plans shifted mid-sentence, how often certainty was replaced with flexibility, how frequently reassurance was used instead of clarity. There were no arguments, no emotional scenes, no dramatic realizations, just a quiet recognition that something didn't align with the promises I'd been handed so gently. One evening, as I cleaned the kitchen, his phone lit up briefly on the counter. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The notification disappeared as quickly as it came, but the timing stayed with me. It always came down to timing. Promise Day had been about the future. What I was seeing now belonged to the present, and it didn't behave the same way. I didn't feel humiliated. I didn't feel betrayed in the way movies portray it. What I felt was composed disbelief, the kind that makes you straighten your posture instead of raising your voice, the kind that makes you listen more carefully instead of reacting. That night, I wrote nothing down. I saved nothing. I confronted nothing. I simply acknowledged quietly that trust without verification is still a choice, and I was no longer choosing blindly. There was dignity in waiting. There was self-respect in observing. Promise Day hadn't failed me. It had revealed something, not through words, but through absence, not through conflict, but through timing. And for the first time, I understood that love doesn't break loudly. It fractures silently, leaving the structure standing while the foundation begins to shift. I didn't know then where this awareness would lead. I only knew that the promises I'd believed were no longer enough on their own, and that understanding stayed with me, calm, steady, and unresolved, waiting for clarity to catch up with truth. After Teddy Day passed, life didn't fracture loudly. It continued. Mornings still arrived on time, coffee still brewed at the same hour. The house remained orderly, familiar. If someone had walked through our front door, they would have seen nothing unusual. No raised voices, no visible tension, just two adults moving through a shared routine. But something inside me had shifted, quietly, decisively. I didn't start searching for answers because I wanted to accuse him. I started because I wanted clarity, the kind that doesn't argue back, the kind that doesn't depend on tone or memory or explanation, the kind that exists whether anyone admits it or not. I began noticing small things first, not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent. He had always been predictable with time. Meetings ran late sometimes, but they followed a pattern. Midweek dinners with clients, monthly check-ins, quarterly travel. I'd learned the rhythm over years, without effort. That rhythm was changing. Not enough to cause alarm, just enough to feel off. Wednesdays became flexible. Thursday evenings stretched longer than usual. He'd still text, still explain, still sound reasonable. Nothing careless, nothing obvious, just slightly misaligned. I didn't question him, I questioned the sequence. I opened our shared financial app one afternoon, not with suspicion, but habit. I was reconciling expenses for the month, something I'd always handled. Groceries, utilities, insurance, the normal architecture of a shared life. That's when I noticed the first number. It wasn't the amount that caught my attention, it was the timing. A transfer midweek, not scheduled, categorized vaguely, not large enough to disrupt, not small enough to disappear. I told myself it was nothing, then I didn't close the app. I scrolled back. There was another one the week before, and another the week before that. Different amounts, similar timing, always midweek, always after deposits, always quiet. I didn't confront him. I didn't even mention it. Instead, I did something unfamiliar to me in relationships. I paused. Over the next few days, I observed more than I spoke. I listened more than I explained. I let routines reveal themselves. Patterns don't announce their meaning. They wait for attention. I exported statements, not aggressively, not secretly, just methodically. Dates, amounts, notes. When laid out together, they told a story no single transaction could. The transfers weren't random. They followed structure. Every time income entered the account, a portion moved shortly after. Not immediately, not recklessly, with intention. I remember sitting at the dining table one afternoon, sunlight crossing the same surface where I'd once arranged Teddy Day chocolates. The house was quiet. My phone rested beside me, screen glowing softly with rows of numbers. And in that stillness, something became clear. This was no longer about love. It was about truth. I compared calendars next, not because I suspected infidelity in the dramatic sense, but because timelines don't lie when placed side by side. Client dinners aligned with withdrawals, extended meetings matched transfers, long days followed deposits. It wasn't a secret life, it was a parallel one. I felt no urge to cry, no rush of anger, just a strange calm, like when a puzzle finally reveals its edge pieces. The teddy bear was still on the couch. I hadn't moved it, not because it mattered anymore, but because it reminded me of who I had been just days earlier, trusting, open, certain. The contrast wasn't painful, it was instructive. I realized something important in that moment. Betrayal doesn't always arrive as shock. Sometimes it arrives as information, and information changes posture. I adjusted how I moved through the house, how I asked questions, how much I shared, not out of punishment, but precision. I began documenting quietly, screenshots, notes, dates, not obsessively, cleanly. Preparation became my language. He continued as usual, calm, pleasant, present enough. If he sensed distance, he didn't name it, and I didn't offer explanations. Silence, I was learning, doesn't mean confusion. Sometimes it means focus. I also noticed something else, something subtler. My emotions were changing shape. Where there had once been hope, there was now neutrality. Where there had been expectation, there was awareness. I wasn't grieving yet. I wasn't planning either. I was orienting. At night, lying beside him, I listened to the rhythm of his breathing the same way I'd once listened for reassurance. Only now, it wasn't intimacy I was measuring, it was alignment, and alignment was gone. I didn't feel smaller because of it, I felt steadier. I thought about Teddy Day, how innocent it had felt, how confident I'd been in gestures and symbols. Not embarrassed, just educated. Symbols only mean something when behavior supports them. By the end of that week, I knew enough. Not everything, but enough to stop wondering. Enough to understand that whatever explanation existed would never be as accurate as the records were. Enough to know that love hadn't failed loudly, it had been redirected quietly. And that realization didn't make me reactive, it made me ready. By the time Promise Day had slipped fully into the past, something inside me had already changed shape. Not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. I didn't wake up angry. I didn't rehearse arguments in the shower. I didn't imagine conversations where I would finally demand explanations. That phase never came. What arrived instead was something quieter and far more stable: clarity. Once the patterns became undeniable, I stopped asking emotional questions. I stopped searching his face for reassurance. I stopped measuring his tone, his pauses, his carefully chosen words. Words, I had learned, could be arranged to sound sincere. Records could not. I began preparing, not reacting. The first thing I did was separate my emotions from my actions. I treated the situation the way I treated work projects, methodically, without assumptions, without urgency. I created folders, digital ones, physical ones, each labeled simply by dates, not accusations, not conclusions, just timelines. Every document I gathered felt strangely grounding. Bank statements, transaction histories, email timestamps, calendar entries, travel confirmations. Everything lined up in a way his promises never had. The contrast was sharp, but unemotional. It didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. I remember thinking, almost calmly, this is no longer a personal matter. This is an administrative one. That was the moment control shifted. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney on a Tuesday morning, not dramatically, not secretly, just another appointment on my calendar, wedged between a grocery run and a routine work call. I chose someone recommended for discretion, not aggression, experience, not spectacle. When I sat across from her, I didn't tell a story. I handed over organized files, dates, amounts, sequences. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't ask me how I felt. She didn't need to. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. What surprised me most wasn't her reaction. It was my own. I was steady. No shaking hands, no wavering voice, no urge to justify why I hadn't noticed sooner. I didn't apologize for trusting. I didn't explain promise day or the softness of his words or the way belief settles quietly into a marriage. None of that mattered here. Facts had replaced feelings. As she reviewed everything, she explained options, not emotionally, but structurally, what each document meant, what each pattern suggested, what was verifiable, what was not. Her language was precise, clean, predictable. Predictability felt like safety. I didn't ask what he would say when confronted. I didn't ask how he might react. I didn't ask what would happen if he denied everything. Those questions belonged to a version of me that believed conversations solved problems. This version of me believed preparation did. Over the next few weeks, I moved quietly. I redirected income streams. I opened accounts in my own name. I documented every step, not out of fear, but out of principle. If something needed explaining later, it would already be explained. There were no dramatic scenes at home. We still shared space, still exchanged polite conversation, still operated within the familiar rhythms of daily life. If he noticed a shift, he didn't mention it. If he didn't, that told me enough. Silence became a kind of language. The more I said nothing, the clearer everything became. There was no need to accuse, no need to corner him with questions, no need to watch his reactions. I wasn't gathering confessions, I was finalizing clarity. Promise Day had been filled with gentle assurances, plans spoken softly over coffee, a future outlined with careful optimism. I remembered how his voice had sounded that morning, steady, warm, convincing. The documents did not sound like that. They were unemotional, flat, exact, and they aligned with each other perfectly. That alignment gave me a calm I hadn't felt in months. I realized something important during that time. Power does not announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't raise its voice. Real authority settles in quietly once decisions are made internally. There was a moment, late one evening, when I stood alone in the living room. The house was silent. The Promise Day card was still tucked away, unread now, unnecessary. I didn't feel sad looking at it. I felt distant, not numb, resolved. I understood then that the outcome no longer depended on his explanations. It depended on my follow-through, and I was prepared for that. No explanations were needed. The records were complete. By the time everything was in place, I felt no urge to rush toward an ending. Control doesn't demand immediacy. It waits until everything is stable. And for the first time since Promise Day, stability was something I wasn't promised. It was something I had already secured. I did not announce the ending when it arrived. There was no dramatic mourning, no raised voice, no moment that demanded witnesses. It unfolded the way truth always does, quietly, methodically, and without asking permission. By the time Promise Day came around again in my memory, it no longer carried the weight it once did. It wasn't painful anymore. It was instructional. I remember sitting alone at the kitchen table one evening, the house unusually still. Not empty, just calm. The kind of calm that only exists after decisions have already been made. The papers were stacked neatly to my right, not as an accusation, but as confirmation. Each page had already served its purpose. There was nothing left to prove. What surprised me most was not the outcome, but how steady I felt inside it. For months, my life had been shaped by soft words and quieter contradictions. Promises spoken gently, always at the right moment, always with the correct tone. They had sounded sincere, they had felt safe, and for a long time I had believed that intention mattered more than structure. I know better now. Structure is what holds when intention dissolves. The documents did not argue with me. They didn't need to. They simply aligned. Dates matched, amounts balanced, signatures repeated themselves with a precision that left no space for interpretation. What once felt confusing now felt complete. This wasn't a victory, it was a conclusion. I didn't confront him with the ending. There was no need. By the time the process reached its final stage, everything that mattered had already been separated. Accounts, responsibilities, expectations. What remained between us was no longer emotional, it was administrative. And that, strangely, was a relief. I signed the final set of papers on a weekday afternoon in an office that smelled faintly of clean paper and quiet authority. The attorney didn't congratulate me, she simply nodded, the way professionals do when something has been handled correctly. There was no drama in her voice, no sympathy layered over competence, just confirmation. As I walked out, I realized something important. I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was stepping forward with clarity. The promise I had been waiting for all along hadn't come from him. It came from myself. That night, I went home and opened the windows. The air felt different, not because anything had changed outside, but because I had changed inside. The silence in the room no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. I poured myself a glass of water and stood there for a moment, looking around. The house no longer felt like a shared space defined by compromise. It felt like mine, measured, intentional, grounded. For the first time in a long while, I slept without replaying conversations in my head. The days that followed were uneventful in the best possible way. No tension, no anticipation, no waiting for explanations that would never arrive. My routine settled into something honest. Work, rest, small moments of reflection. Stability returned, not as a promise, but as a practice. I didn't feel the need to explain my decision to anyone. The people who mattered could see it in the way I carried myself. I spoke slowly. I listened more carefully. I no longer filled silence with reassurance. Silence, I had learned, is not emptiness. It is authority. Promise Day had once been about words, soft assurances spoken in close proximity, meant to soothe rather than secure. I used to believe that the gentler the promise, the truer it must be. Now I understand that truth doesn't whisper, it documents itself. What I gained wasn't freedom in the dramatic sense, it was alignment. My life finally matched my values. My future was no longer shaped by what someone said they would do, but by what I could verify, protect, and sustain. I reclaimed my name in the smallest ways first, updating records, redirecting correspondence, establishing boundaries that didn't require explanation. Each step felt procedural, not emotional, and that was the point. Emotion had done its work earlier. This phase belonged to clarity. I didn't hate him. Hate requires energy, and I no longer needed to spend any. What I felt instead was distance, the healthy kind, the kind that allows perspective without resentment. When I thought back to that original promise day, I could see it clearly now. The morning light, the carefully chosen words, the way I had leaned into belief because belief felt easier than doubt. I don't regret that version of myself. She trusted because she didn't have evidence not to. But I am grateful I didn't stay her. Today, my promises sound different. They are fewer, more precise, backed by action. I promise myself consistency. I promise myself transparency. I promise myself that comfort will never again replace truth. There is strength in knowing what you will no longer negotiate. The ending of the story doesn't look like revenge. It looks like balance. Financial stability restored, emotional noise reduced, independence reestablished without spectacle. No one applauded, no one needed to. Some endings are not meant to be witnessed, they are meant to be lived. Promise Day still exists on the calendar, but its meaning has changed. It no longer reminds me of what was said, it reminds me of what I learned. that promises spoken softly still can collapse under scrutiny, and that documents, quiet, emotional, and exact, never lie. I didn't lose love, I found truth. And that, finally, was enough.